Rachel never got to make her own decisions. For some reason, all the important decisions in her life were always made by someone else, thus depriving her of the right to choose and the feeling of freedom. It was the same when she was little. Her parents decided that the girl should love music and made her attend music school. Rachel loved her parents deeply, and so she didn't want to argue with them, choosing to study music diligently instead. Her parents weren't well off, so they adhered to a rational approach in all areas of their life. When Rachel grew up, they married their daughter off to a wealthy businessman, Dexter, who was 5 years older than Rachel. It was unlikely that it was a love marriage, but being the perfect daughter, Rachel accepted the will of her mom and dad. At first, the new family was doing fine, living at the husband's house. But then Dexter realized that his wife was complacent by her nature and started using her weakness without shame. Most of the time, any changes in the husband's behavior were a reflection of his success or failures at work, which invariably affected how he would treat Rachel. When the wife found out that she was pregnant, a faint light of hope awakened in her soul. She thought that maybe with the birth of her child, Dexter would change and become more tender and affectionate. And the man did change, but unfortunately it was for the worse. He became even more intolerable. Little Molly happened to be born right when Dexter was going through an extremely successful period at work. So he left all the responsibility of raising a baby to his wife. When the baby was sick or misbehaving, Rachel dealt with everything on her own, trying to shelter her rich husband from unnecessary stress. Unfortunately, her self-sacrifice didn't help save her family, as over time, Dexter turned into a real tyrant. The husband could come home from work late at night and start a terrible fight. At one point, Rachel even caught herself thinking that he was probably cheating on her. And it wasn't the first time she saw lipstick on his collar and woman's hair stuck to the lapel of his jacket. One day, Rachel finally plucked up the courage and asked her husband about it directly. Dexter's only response was a scream out in anger. "Is there something you don't like? Feel free to leave. No one's keeping you here." It was the first time when Rachel seriously thought about it. This was mainly due to the fact that little Molly turned 5 the next day, and she was becoming more like her mother with each passing second. She was just as gentle, impressionable, and vulnerable as her mother. "Our daughter understands everything now. I doubt that she enjoys listening to her parents argue all the time," Rachel thought anxiously, tired of the endless nagging of her dictator husband. But even given her situation, she couldn't turn to her parents for help, because having married off their daughter, they now believed that her place was next to her husband. "Remember, Rachel, it doesn't matter what happens with your husband. You can't come back here," said her mother, who spent her life living in a similar situation, obeying her husband's every wish. No one knows how much longer Rachel and her daughter might have lived under the same roof with Dexter, if he hadn't once again decided everything for his wife. "So here's the thing, I'm tired of living with you, and I found someone else. You can pack your things and get out of here," announced the husband for no apparent reason. Barely holding back her tears, Rachel helped little Molly get dressed and packed up her things. It is worth saying that the woman didn't take many things, but the important part was not to forget the violin, which meant a lot to Rachel. It was this violin that Rachel played when she got her first music lessons as a child. Molly couldn't understand why Daddy was kicking them out of the house and kept looking at Rachel in the eyes, trying to find the answer in them. But there was nothing there except for frozen tears and resentment. Luckily for the mother and her little daughter, they managed to quickly find a place to stay. It happened when the tearful Rachel was walking down the street, holding little Molly by the hand. "Excuse me, ma'am, why are you crying? Is there anything I can do to help?" An old woman that was walking by asked the young mother, touching her shoulder. Rachel only sobbed and shook her head in response, but the kind woman didn't give up and invited the woman and her daughter to come over to her house. There, over a cup of tea in the kitchen, the young woman shared her sad story with the stranger. The old woman's name was Deborah Wilson. After listening to her guest, she thought for a minute or two, and then invited Rachel and her daughter to stay with her. Moreover, Deborah adamantly refused to accept any rent money from the young mother. Rachel and little Molly silently hugged Mrs. Wilson, causing the old woman to tear up. "Hush, hush, dear. It's me who should be thanking you for not letting me die alone. the woman whispered, feeling her mood improve. Thanks to Mrs. Wilson, Rachel and her daughter now had a place to stay, and Mrs. Wilson became like a grandmother and a nanny to Molly, allowing Rachel to find a job. She got a job playing the violin in an orchestra, which performed at all kinds of events. Looking at her mother, Molly also started learning to play the violin, which made Mrs. Wilson very happy. She treated Molly like her own granddaughter. Having left Dexter, Rachel's life gradually improved, and despite the fact that she didn't have a boyfriend, she was happy to live a normal, quiet life. The young woman didn't know it yet, but fate had its own plans for her. One day, as Rachel was walking through a fall park with Molly, she enjoyed the beautiful nature, painted in gold and crimson. Molly was holding tightly to her rag doll Mary, which was one of the few toys she took from her father's house. The little girl wanted to make a bouquet for her mother from the fallen leaves, so she put the doll aside and started collecting the leaves. And when Rachel already had a whole bunch of golden leaves in her hands, suddenly it turned out that Molly couldn't find her doll. Tears instantly started flowing down the girl's face because Molly wasn't just a toy for her, but a faithful friend and a sister with whom the girl shared her most intimate secrets. Rachel and Molly had been looking for Mary for a couple of hours when they were approached by an important-looking man. He was about 45 years old, with silverish gray hair on his temples and blue eyes. "Excuse me, ma'am, is there anything I could help you with?" the stranger asked, looking at Molly's tear-stained face with alarm and pity. Rachel only shrugged and smiled uncertainly at the man in response. He understood everything without words and immediately joined the search party. Time passed quickly, and when it was already dark, the stranger asked if he could take Rachel and her daughter home. On their way to Mrs. Wilson's house, the man told a little about himself. As it turned out, his name was Joseph Anderson, and he liked playing the violin, just like Rachel. He'd even studied at the music school. Talking to Joseph, Rachel realized that he was a very nice person, and as they were about to part at the door to Mrs. Wilson's house, Rachel caught herself thinking that she'd like to see him again. Despite the fact that they never found Mary the doll, Mr. Anderson smiled affectionately and promised the girl and her mother that he would definitely continue the search tomorrow. "Thank you, Joseph. My daughter and I are very grateful." Rachel said goodbye, feeling something pleasant and unfamiliar stir in her soul. It should be said that the man did fulfill his promise and came back the next day. As one would expect, they still couldn't find the doll. However, it turned out that Joseph had a surprise in case the search was unsuccessful. Taking out a sealed envelope from his pocket, the man solemnly handed it to the girl. "Take this, sweetheart. It's for you," Joseph said and smiled mysteriously. Since Molly couldn't read yet, Rachel read the letter for her. As it turned out, the letter was written on behalf of Mary the doll. She explained that she'd left for another country because she wanted to travel and see the world. Tears immediately disappeared from Molly's eyes, and she smiled sweetly. Rachel looked gratefully at Joseph, who pretended not to understand what was happening. From that day on, Molly got letters from Mary almost every day. She also got to see Mr. Anderson, who started giving her violin lessons as soon as he learned about the girl's love for music. Meanwhile, the man told her stories about the countries he'd been to and what he saw there. Rachel didn't even notice how it happened, but one day she realized that she was eagerly waiting for Joseph's daily visits and got agitated every time he was late. At this point, their relationship was strictly friendly, and if any one of them had feelings for the other, they kept them secret, hiding them deep in their hearts. Several months passed. To her surprise, Rachel realized that she was in love with Joseph, who never told her anything about his past and seemed very distant and unattainable. One day, while Rachel and Molly were visiting Joseph at his house, Rachel mustered up the courage and said something she'd never said to anyone before Joseph. "I love you," the woman said, taking her beloved by the hand. Having heard Rachel's words, Joseph's face changed. Barely holding back his tears, he said, "I'm sorry, but you can't love me. There's a good reason for this." Feeling dizzy, Rachel voiced her guess aloud. "Are you married? Do you have a family? Children?" Joseph turned even more pale. He looked devastated as he took Rachel by the hand and began his story. As it turned out, the man didn't have a family because he devoted his whole life to music. Unfortunately, Joseph's health problems began a year ago when he started getting persistent headaches. He got a full checkup, and it revealed an untreatable brain tumor, meaning that his chances of survival were equal to 0. And when I was about to completely lose hope, I met Molly. You two changed my life completely. You gave it meaning, Joseph whispered with tears in his eyes. We'll definitely cure you. We'll figure it out. Just don't give up, Rachel exclaimed, hugging the man. But knowing full well that his tumor was inoperable, Joseph shook his head and said, I'd like to give Molly a present before you leave. Then Joseph took a folder out of a drawer and handed it to Rachel. When the woman opened it, she saw Joseph's will inside. Joseph bequeathed all his assets, including his house, to Rachel and her daughter. Then, ignoring the stunned woman, Joseph took a cardboard box out of the closet and called for Molly, who was playing on the front lawn. Here, this is for you, Joseph said, handing the girl a present. Having opened the box, Molly saw a beautiful doll inside. It had the same name Mary written on its hat. I'm giving this all to you because I know that I don't have much time left. All I ask in return is for you to be happy, so that when I look down at you from heaven, I won't have to worry, Joseph said, hugging Rachel and Molly by the shoulders. They didn't know it at the time, but it was the last conversation they would ever have. Joseph passed away the next day. Rachel cried her eyes out over the death of the man she truly loved. But as we all know, time flies by, and it can truly heal wounds. 12 years have passed, and the lives of Rachel and Molly changed drastically. Rachel found the strength to move on after Joseph's death. She met a man, fell in love, and gave birth to a beautiful son. And little Molly remembered everything that Mr. Anderson taught her. She got accepted into a music school and is now studying there. She kept her doll Mary through all those years, and when she visits Joseph's grave, she plays an excerpt from her favorite piece of music on the violin.